The night the contingency failed, chaos arrived like a precise instrument. A bridge cable snapped mid-span, cars hung from taut steel, and a concrete overpass peeled away as if an invisible hand had unthreaded the world. Batman was there, not as rumor but as procedure, deploying layered protocols, drones and armored silencers, executing contingency rails he'd spent a lifetime tuning for every variable, and his command center translated certainty into immediate motion. A man in a plain yellow jumpsuit walked across the wreckage barefoot, set a single hand against a sagging support, and the collapse stopped as if someone had asked gravity to take a pause, while Batman's algorithms hunted for anything to exploit. Scans returned normal vitals, no radiation, no tech, no strain. Instruments and profiles produced only ordinary human data that contradicted a live tableau of impossible outcomes, turning procedure into a question mark in front of witnesses. This is not an anomaly you file away. It is a hinge moment where rulebooks begin to tear, and what they cannot model will force harder choices. This is only the beginning, and worse is coming. If you follow this channel, subscribe once and listen closely. I'm not asking for views, I'm warning you. Every choice made to contain what can't be measured will have consequences, and the next moves by those who think they can control it will make things far worse. The overpass was already failing when Batman's glide line cut through the dust, his boots finding purchase on a service beam that should not have been exposed to open air, and the convoy below had begun to accordion into a tangle of stalled vehicles and shouted directions. He had prepared for this kind of cascade for years, because infrastructure failures invite opportunists and panic in equal measure, and his contingency rails accounted for both. Drones fanned outward in a pattern that would flag unusual heat, mass displacement, or kinetic signatures, and the command feed from the Batcave began to layer structural models over the live collapse. Saitama walked into the scene from the pedestrian access, as if he had taken a wrong turn on his way to a convenience store, stepping around a severed cable and glancing up at a sagging span that was about to drop a full meter. Batman's thermal scan painted him as a human silhouette with a resting heart rate, while the LiDAR overlay registered the same man placing his palm against a support strut and halting a progressive shear that should have propagated along the beam. Alfred's voice arrived in Batman's ear with the calm cadence of someone used to improbable nights, nodding that the scan showed no augmentation or exoskeletal reinforcement. Cause became effect as Batman's stabilization foam deployed along a cracked seam, buying seconds for emergency crews to clear a trapped sedan, and the foam's expansion should have been the only variable affecting load distribution. Instead, the stress map flattened along a second seam that Saitama steadied to let a child crawl past a bent guardrail, and the algorithm tagged the normalization as an error because no compensatory force had been recorded. Batman redirected a drone to focus on the man's forearm, expecting micro-tremors or muscle activation consistent with load bearing, and found none. Commissioner Gordon arrived at the perimeter with a line of patrol cars, his reaction framed by the practical need to keep civilians back, and he asked whether the vigilante had the collapse under control. Batman answered that he was assessing, even as a third cable began to slacken, and the roadway dipped in a way that would have forced an immediate evacuation under any other night. Saitama shifted his stance to let a paramedic pass, and the dip halted across a 10-meter span without a corresponding change in any field Batman's suite could detect. The first confrontation was procedural rather than physical when Batman approached and asked the man to step clear of the support for safety reasons, and Saitama nodded, moving his hand away without argument. The stress map immediately darkened along the seam, and the roadway settled another centimeter before Saitama put his hand back to keep a stroller from tipping. Alfred flagged the sequence as a correlation that could not be explained by foam expansion or drone tether tension. Batman ran a second scan at a narrower band, looking for metabolic spikes or energy output that might justify the footage, and the return showed normal skin temperature and oxygen saturation. Saitama answered Gordon's question about whether he was injured with a casual "I'm fine," and asked if there was a vending machine nearby because he'd skipped dinner. The absence of strain in voice or pulse forced Batman to mark the variable as unprofiled. Irreversible escalation arrived when a maintenance gantry above the span began to tilt under redistributed load, and Batman fired a grapnel to catch the shift while ordering a full clearance beneath. Saitama stepped beneath the gantry to guide two workers out and placed his hand against a column that should have been carrying half the deck's weight, and the tilt stopped without registering force transfer. Batman's contingency rail for spontaneous structural failure updated in real time, and every model it produced returned the same problem. There was no durability threshold to target because there was no measurable interaction. As emergency lights painted the scene in alternating bands, Batman realized that a plan built on profiling, limits, and behavior would require a profile to begin with, and the man in the yellow jumpsuit provided none. The overpass held for now, but the system that would decide what to do next had already begun to rewrite itself around an absence it could not quantify. Batman began where he always began. He closed the distance between evidence and explanation and turned every tool he owned into a microscope. Because when something refuses to fit into a model, the first move is to gather more data and deny the world the excuse of ignorance. Back at the Batcave, the scene feed looped at 300% while Alfred queued up thermal overlays, muscle strain analyses, and heartbeat spectrograms, each layer rendering the man in the yellow jumpsuit as utterly ordinary in every channel that mattered to human survival. Batman watched the telemetry with a patience that had been honed in 1,000 nights, running facial microexpression analysis against databases of conditioned fighters and accidental heroes. And yet, with every metric that should have narrowed the possibilities, he found the same blunt answer: normal. He instructed Lucius to stand by for hardware augment tests while he prepared a quiet interview protocol. Because if the anomaly could not be exposed through force, then perhaps it could be baited into error by conversation and circumstance. The interview was clinical because Batman made everything clinical. He brought Saitama into a soundproofed containment bay that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper, and the room had the symmetry of a place designed to minimize chance. Cameras framed the man in yellow who sat barefoot on a steel chair and accepted a paper cup with the same casual gratitude someone might show for a free sample at a grocery store, and Batman opened with the questions that stripped intent from pretense: name, origin, reason for being here. Saitama answered plainly, voice flat and conversational, and his responses read like weather reports because they contained no defensive hedging, no rehearsed evasions, and no performance of power. Alfred provided tea. Commissioner Gordon watched through the observation pane with a pragmatic skepticism, and every physiological monitor pinned a pulse and temperature within human norms, even while the feed outside showed a support beam held in balance by what looked like a person's bare hand. Batman pivoted to the diagnostics that had once been infallible, because pattern recognition had kept him alive, and it had kept cities intact in the past, and he deployed a battery of non-invasive tests designed to probe for hidden systems rather than provoke injury. Lucius ran scans for implanted materials and signal anomalies, probing the electromagnetic spectrum in bands that normally reveal clandestine augmentations or covert power sources, and all the receivers hummed a clean, ordinary frequency. Batman asked Saitama to perform a series of controlled lifts and holds with calibrated weights and pressure plates beneath each foot, measurements meant to reveal fatigue thresholds or incremental tissue failure, and the plates reported stability like an unremarkable human athlete resting between sets. When he requested a cognitive load test to see whether stress or decision pressure altered physiological responses, the results were flat and unspectacular. No cortisol spikes, no amygdala flares, no deviation from a baseline that bolstered any tactical assumption. Concern crept in the way it always did, not as a sentiment but as a change in operational posture, because when reliable instruments fail, you must widen the aperture of observation and be willing to convert assumption into contingency. Batman ordered a localized probe by WayneTech drones to record micro-vibrations on Saitama's skin as he applied incremental force to a suspended hull section in the hangar, and the LiDAR returned a trace that refused to map a transfer through tissue. Lucius voiced a hypothesis about a distributed field or a phase differential that would not show up in direct scans, and Batman countered with a plan to isolate variables by removing the man from objects he had touched and seeing whether the normalization ripple followed him or lingered after he left. Saitama, entirely uninterested in the protocol's drama, agreed to the test and asked if anyone had a spare bag of chips because he'd found the scene hungry work, and that ordinary remark became the thing that refused to be used as evidence. The controlled separation was simplicity itself, a sterile chamber with an automated rotary platform, telemetry rigs, and a line of technicians standing at the ready while cameras recorded every angle, and Batman leaned over the controls like a conductor expecting a single note to reveal the chord. Saitama stood on the platform barefoot, shifted his weight, and then stepped off to walk the hangar aisles as the system recorded pre-contact and post-contact baselines across a dozen nodes. The technicians watched their instruments with the kind of attention exhausted by long nights, and the pattern they expected, a decay curve, a residual signature, a hysteresis in structural response, never appeared. What did appear was the same stubborn normality in his vitals, and the same dissonant reality outside the nodes where concrete and metal behaved as though a movable hand had been pressed against them, and asked them to remember a different shape. Strategic doubt arrived like a report from an off-grid source. Batman's contingency catalog was built on assumptions of limit and predictability, and the man in the yellow suit simply provided none of that architecture to exploit. He moved through tests with the indifference of someone answering a clerical duty, and the lack of defensive instinct under observation meant there was no psychological vector to flip into compliance or error. Batman escalated to behavioral mapping, feeding live footage into predictive models that attempted to determine likely points of contact, social triggers, and avoidance patterns, because if you cannot break a thing you can at least predict where it will be. The models spat back patterns so generic they were useless: grocery store routes, small kindnesses, a boredom-driven schedule, and Batman realized that the thing he faced could not be cornered by routine. That realization forced a change in resources rather than tactics, because you cannot fight an absence with the same weapons you use against a presence. You must reframe the fight to test borders rather than bodies. Batman ordered WayneTech to construct a portable perimeter of overlapping experimental fields, mass gradients to simulate added weight, harmonic disruptors to introduce phase noise, electromagnetic cages to probe for hidden conductors, and inertial dampers to test whether motion could be denied without contact. The plan was surgical and redundant by design, a lattice intended to produce differential failures that would yield a traceable pattern when compared across modalities. Lucius hesitated at the moral calculus of building a device meant to impose strain on a human being, even an anomalous one, and Batman acknowledged the hesitation by insisting the tests remain non-lethal and reversible while prioritizing the city's safety above institutional comfort. Irreversible escalation came not as violence but as institutional pressure when WayneTech's engineers ran simulations and found that the lattice, if deployed in an urban test, would require a carve-out of critical services and temporary evacuation of a radius that would attract public attention and political risk. Commissioner Gordon, balancing civic duty and public confidence, pressed for transparency and for a legal framework to cover what would otherwise read as an experiment on a person. Batman responded in the language of necessity, arguing that leaving the anomaly in the open while they argued about ethics would expose far more people to risk than a contained test could. And the debate pushed the action from a laboratory curiosity to a municipal operation requiring official oversight. Saitama, who had caught a nap in an empty conference chair while the men argued, woke and asked whether the test would have snacks, and his disarmingly normal priorities narrowed the moral argument in a way no model anticipated. As the night lengthened, the plan crystallized. A controlled field trial in a decommissioned rail yard, limited evacuations, redundancies to protect infrastructure, and an array of instruments so comprehensive it might have satisfied the most skeptical committee. Batman stood over the blueprints while Alfred fed him information and Lucius prepared the first nodes, and every line on the plan was a tacit admission that his contingency rails had a blind spot. The city would be asked to sacrifice a night's quiet for a chance at comprehension, and the first device was scheduled to pulse at dawn under the watch of cameras, medics, and a legal team ready to contain fallout. Saitama, when told of the schedule, shrugged and asked whether anyone would be watching cartoons afterward, and that shrug made Batman understand a hard fact. The man would not behave like an enemy even when every institution braced like one. The last image before the feed cut was procedural and small. Technicians ratcheting the outer ring of the test lattice into place under WayneTech lights, while a patrol cordon extended down the rail lines, and Batman's systems logged a series of readiness checks that would be useless if the thing they sought to measure refused to be measured. The portable perimeter hummed softly in the cold air, a promise of answers or a provocation that could break more than machines, and the decision to test had already set events into motion that would pull in allies, governments, and a public that demanded both safety and explanation. The morning after the rail yard test, the conversation left the Batcave like a pebble thrown into a mirror, fracturing committees and conference rooms across the city, because a man who looked like any other had refused to behave like anything predictable under engineering scrutiny. WayneTech's crisis team moved faster than press releases, their emergency ops center converting telemetry into dashboards and feeding every available model into a lattice of probability that was supposed to spit out answers. And Lucius Fox took direct control of the hardware stream, routing feeds into redundant arrays, while Alfred coordinated legal counsel to keep the operation within a fragile municipal window. The first corporate effect was bureaucratic. Contracts were dusted off and non-disclosure clauses invoked, because corporations understand that uncertainty invites competitors and lawsuits, and WayneTech's board decided overnight to treat the anomaly not as an oddity but as an asset to be indexed. Batman watched the company spin its machines into a project while taking the same sober view he always took toward leverage. Data is control, and control is the only currency when limits evaporate. WayneTech's response was practical before it was political. Drone swarms and armored survey rigs redeployed to create a moving perimeter that could be reconstituted within minutes, and field engineers set up a mobile diagnostics node in the decommissioned rail yard that now served as the city's unofficial lab. Saitama arrived at the site with the same pedestrian indifference he brought to every scene, stepping over cable runs to ask whether the coffee was free, and accepting a blanket when the wind cut too sharp, and his manner disarmed technicians who had trained to expect fear or defiance in subjects under observation. Batman supervised the instrument panel while running algorithmic comparisons against every dataset the city had, and the paradox hardened. Every sensor that mattered recorded ordinary human vitals and an absence of extraneous emissions. And yet, when Saitama leaned against a mangled rail to help a trapped worker, the damage pattern outside the perimeter corrected itself in a way that no model could predict. The engineers logged the anomaly as a persistent variable and retooled the array to measure presence rather than energy, because they had to measure something even if it meant inventing new units of analysis. Media and municipal politics pushed their way into the room with the blunt force of optics, because WayneTech's perimeter was not a secret, and the press had already made Saitama an image people could not stop discussing. Commissioner Gordon insisted on a public safety statement that did not sound like capitulation, and the mayor's office drafted language meant to reassure while preserving legal leeway for further tests. But public appetite refused the gray of cautious governance and demanded either salvation or threat designation. That pressure translated into boards voting to escalate. WayneTech proposed a commercial partnership with the city to fund a wider trial that would test the anomaly on infrastructure in a controlled urban block, an idea that promised data at scale, but required an evacuation and a temporary suspension of municipal services that would be visible and politically risky. Batman recognized the leverage in scale, more data, more vectors, but he also recognized the weaponization risk when corporate imperatives begin to outpace ethical restraint, and he pushed back privately, arguing that expansion should follow comprehension, not policy deadlines. Legal escalation arrived in the form of an emergency municipal ordinance drafted by a city council that had been roped into the debate. Because when engineers ask for access to real-world variables, politicians answer with permits and audits rather than morality. The ordinance authorized WayneTech to implement containment trials within specified zones, provided the company accepted liability and public oversight, and it created a legal framework that made the tests legitimate in the eyes of government, while also giving WayneTech cover to act swiftly. Amanda Waller's name surfaced in whispered channels as a stabilizing but uncompromising force advocating for stronger measures should tests fail, and the whisper turned to a directive when federal liaison teams requested access to WayneTech's telemetry under national security prerogatives. Batman's role shifted subtly from investigator to intermediary, as he tried to preserve operational safety, while avoiding an institutional clampdown that would hand the anomaly to actors whose priorities were strategic denial rather than civilian well-being. Meanwhile, the technical approach bifurcated in ways that revealed differing philosophies about risk. WayneTech engineers wanted to scale horizontally, deploying redundant fields across city blocks to see if the anomaly's effects aggregated or diffused with density, while Lucius and Batman favored deep, controlled probes that isolated individual interaction modalities without inviting collateral consequences. The debate turned on measurement versus containment, and it exposed the moral calculus at play when private capability meets public safety. Are you allowed to risk a neighborhood's normalcy to learn how a single person alters reality, or does the value of knowledge stop where people's lives begin? Saitama remained blissfully uninterested in the politics, agreeing to whatever tests were proposed as long as someone promised him a hot meal afterward, and that ordinary condition made the institutional response even more combustible because it denied the most convenient narrative that this was an enemy to be coerced into compliance. A named reaction shifted the dynamic when Lois Lane published a piece that framed the anomaly as both guardian and puzzle, and her reporting changed public sentiment from fearful curiosity into moral demand, because the city's residents wanted transparency about a presence that altered the balance between risk and rescue. Protests and vigils formed at WayneTech gates, some in gratitude and others in anger, and the city's social fabric frayed around the edges even as the company's scanners hummed on. Batman watched the feeds with a sense of procedural dread, because every additional stakeholder increased the chance that someone would unilaterally act on incomplete data, and that possibility carried consequences that could not be insurance bonded away. Lucius warned that a scalable urban trial would create overlapping variables the team could not decouple, and WayneTech's board countered that, without scale, they could never create the comparative datasets that would produce an answer, and the split pushed the city into a difficult vote. Irreversible escalation came not from another test but from a decision. The mayor signed the ordinance to permit a limited urban trial, a legal green light that committed public resources and personnel to an experiment that could not be guaranteed safe. And the moment the pen finished its arc, the operation moved from theoretical risk to operational reality. WayneTech began deploying mobile nodes into a designated block, rerouting transit and requesting voluntary evacuations, not as a suggestion, but as a municipal order. And the company placed indemnity bonds while the council scheduled an oversight hearing for the following week. Batman recognized the inevitability of the move. Institutions moved to buy certainty with authority, and he understood the moral peril. Once the public domain is ceded to a corporate apparatus to test an unmeasured variable, the option to retract becomes politically and logistically fraught. Saitama, asked whether he would participate in the urban trial, smiled and agreed because he had nothing to gain by refusal and too many simple needs to complicate his choices. And as technicians tightened the nodes around the perimeter, the first urban-scale pulse was scheduled to fire at dawn. The last image before teams dispersed for the night was a city block wrapped in WayneTech lights, streets cleared of cars, and a community told to trust a company with tools it had promised would solve a problem, while Batman watched those lights from a rooftop and felt the old certainty erode into something brittle. Sensors would collect, cables would hum, and cameras would not lie, but the paradox remained. Every instrument so far read common humanity while outcomes kept bending the world, and the system's new move, to test in the open, had set events into motion where corporate reach met public consequence, and a morning's pulse would force institutions to either obtain comprehension or accept culpability for what they could not measure. By the time dawn reaches the designated trial block, the city has already begun to behave like a system under observation, because transit has been rerouted, storefronts shuttered under municipal request, and WayneTech's mobile nodes line the intersections with the sterile symmetry of a temporary laboratory. Batman stands at the edge of the perimeter with Lucius Fox monitoring from the operations van, while Commissioner Gordon coordinates the final evacuation of residents who chose to leave rather than watch their street become an experiment. Saitama arrives with a plastic grocery bag and a yawn, stepping over cable runs to ask whether he should stand somewhere specific, and the simplicity of the question becomes an uncomfortable mirror for an apparatus that required 3 committees to approve its placement. The first pulse is calibrated to create a shallow mass gradient across the block, a gentle denial of motion designed to simulate added weight without contacting skin, and the nodes hum in sequence as technicians watch their dashboards for drift. Saitama shifts his stance to make room for a medic adjusting a stretcher near the curb, and the gradient's heat map dips around his outline without a corresponding change in output at any node. Lucius flags the depression as a moving perimeter that is not tied to power flow, while Batman orders a second pulse to confirm whether the effect follows contact or proximity. Cause becomes effect when a construction scaffold at the far end of the block begins to settle under redistributed load that should have been absorbed by the gradient, and Batman moves to stabilize it with a grapnel while instructing crews to hold position. Saitama walks over to guide 2 workers down the stairs and places a hand on a railing to keep it from tipping, and 3 separate monitors report a temporary normalization across the scaffold's stress lines. The normalization allows the workers to clear safely, but a storefront awning on the opposite side of the street begins to bow as the system compensates for the loss of gradient density nearby. Named reactions arrive through the comms as Lois Lane reports live from a permitted distance, framing the trial as a civic gamble that trades uncertainty for potential safety, and Gordon asks whether the compensation is expected behavior. Batman answers that the array is redistributing as designed, even as Lucius notes that the redistribution is following a human motion rather than a node schedule. Saitama returns to the curb and asks if anyone knows when the test will be over, because he promised to meet someone for lunch, and the ordinariness of the request forces technicians to confront the gap between their subject and their models. The second pulse introduces harmonic noise meant to deny coherent motion across the block, a measure that should create nausea or a compensatory stance in anyone within the field, and the monitors spike with data that resolves everywhere except where Saitama stands. Batman listens for a change in breathing that never comes and watches as a parked delivery truck rocks slightly without transferring load to its tires. Lucius roots a comparison against the rail yard test and finds the same cancellation ripple that cannot be traced through tissue or ground. Irreversible escalation arrives when the block's power grid, temporarily isolated for safety, attempts to compensate for the array's draw and inadvertently deepens the gradient along a side street that had not been scheduled for active testing. A row of streetlights dims in sequence, and a manhole cover begins to tilt under pressure that should not exist in a non-contact field, and Gordon orders a halt to the trial while emergency crews move to secure the area. Batman authorizes a shutdown of the harmonic layer, but the command stalls as safety interlocks attempt to prevent a cascade across nodes that now disagree about their local density. Wonder Woman's voice joins the channel with a request to withdraw Saitama from the block to see whether distance restores uniformity, and Batman relays the suggestion with care. Saitama agrees without hesitation and steps beyond the perimeter tape, pausing only to hand his grocery bag to a volunteer so it doesn't snag on a cable. The heat map responds immediately with a flattening across the scaffold and a deepening along the storefront awning that had begun to bow. The city watches the block hold in one place and settle in another, and the realization spreads that the trial has moved beyond measurement into trade-off, because every normalization appears to invite a compensation elsewhere. Batman orders a controlled vent of the gradient to protect the side street, and Lucius warns that venting will reduce their ability to collect comparative data that might explain the phenomenon. Gordon authorizes the vent anyway, prioritizing public safety over insight, and the nodes hum as they bleed density into the air. As the field thins, a transit signal at the intersection flickers and a bus route is rerouted in real time, and the municipal system begins to speak in the language of zones rather than blocks. Lois reports that adjacent neighborhoods are seeing temporary closures as a precaution, and WayneTech's legal team updates the city on liability thresholds that had not been anticipated at this scale. Saitama, outside the tape, asks whether he should come back in to help with the lights, and the question lands like a choice the city will have to make again. The final event is already in motion when the side street's gradient deepens despite the vent, and a storefront window bows inward as if pressed by a careful hand. Batman looks from the monitors to the man beyond the tape and understands that expanding the trial has expanded the cost, and the next decision will determine whether the city treats presence as a resource or a risk. The moment the side street's storefront bowed inward under a field that was supposed to be thinning, the trial stopped being a municipal experiment and became a federal concern, because infrastructure behaving like memory rather than matter forces jurisdiction to move upward. WayneTech's legal team filed incident reports that triggered automatic notifications to Homeland Security liaisons, and within an hour, a joint tasking order arrived requesting full telemetry access under national safety provisions. Batman remained on the operations line with Lucius as armored vehicles from a federal rapid response unit established a second perimeter beyond the city's tape, their presence less about force than about ownership of the next decision. General Samuel Lane's voice joined the command net with the clipped cadence of someone accustomed to converting anomalies into protocols, and he requested a summary that translated corporate dashboards into operational risk. Lucius explained that every node was reporting ordinary output while outcomes continued to contradict, and Batman added that behavioral mapping of the subject provided no vector for manipulation or fatigue. Saitama, who had been offered a folding chair by a volunteer, listened to the exchange with mild curiosity and asked whether the new trucks meant the test was over, and Gordon's reply that they were just here to help landed with a weight that had little to do with reassurance. Cause became effect when the federal unit deployed a portable inertial denial grid along the outer block, a system designed for riot control that simulates increased effective mass across a controlled radius without physical contact. The grid engaged at a low threshold to avoid distress, and technicians watched for compensatory posture or slowed gait that would indicate a normal interaction with the field. Saitama stood to return the chair and stepped into the grid to let a medic pass, and the local density map dipped around his outline while a parked police cruiser rocked slightly without transferring load to its suspension. Named reactions overlapped as Wonder Woman requested restraint from the Justice League's channel, warning that stacking gradients without comprehension risked trading one hazard for another, and Lane countered that failing to test would leave cities exposed to an unquantified variable. Batman listened for any change in Saitama's breath or pulse and heard none, and Alfred quietly noted that the cruiser's telemetry showed no increase in tire pressure despite the visible shift. Lois Lane reported from the media pen that federal assets were now on site, and the story moved from corporate trial to national security event in the space of a sentence. The military escalation advanced with the deployment of a harmonic disruptor calibrated to introduce phase noise into the grid, a measure intended to deny coherent motion without causing harm, and the two systems began to hum in a layered tone that rattled loose signage. Saitama asked whether the noise would last long because it made his ears itch, and a nearby light pole swayed as if brushed by a wind no anemometer recorded. Lucius rooted the grid's output against WayneTech's earlier pulses and found the same cancellation ripple following Saitama's casual contact with a barricade he steadied for a volunteer. Irreversible escalation arrived when the federal grid attempted to compensate for the dip by deepening density along the block's western edge, a safety routine meant to prevent localized failure that now created a gradient on a street that had been cleared but not instrumented. A row of traffic signals dimmed in sequence, and a fire hydrant cap began to tilt without pressure on its threads, and Gordon ordered crews to hold while Batman requested an immediate rollback. Lane authorized a controlled increase instead, arguing that a measurable response was now a strategic necessity, and the authorization shifted the operation from observation to enforcement in everything but name. Saitama, entirely cooperative, stepped back when asked to exit the grid, and the density map flattened where he had been while deepening near a transit kiosk at the corner. Wonder Woman urged a full shutdown to protect the adjacent blocks, but the federal team initiated a diagnostic pulse to capture comparative data across both systems, and the hum intensified. Batman recognized the pivot from preparedness to pressure, and understood that institutional momentum would not easily reverse, because admitting uncertainty after deploying assets carries political costs. As the diagnostic completed, a maintenance gantry 2 blocks over reported a slight tilt under redistributed load, and WayneTech citywide monitors flagged the change as similar to the rail yard's first anomaly. Lois reported the tilt live, and the public's appetite for explanation surged into demands for control, while Waller's office requested a briefing on whether custody might prevent further incidents. Saitama asked if he should stay put or go home, and the simple question arrived at the exact moment Lane ordered the grid to maintain density until a pattern could be established. The final image before the command net moved to its next step was procedural, federal technicians adjusting the disruptor's frequency, while city crews extended barricades down an adjacent avenue, and Batman watched the monitors split between normalization, where Saitama had been, and compensation where he was not. The grid hummed on, and the decision to keep it active had already set the next failure in motion. By the afternoon, the incident had crossed the threshold where a single nation could plausibly claim stewardship, because WayneTech's telemetry had been requested through treaty channels, and the footage of a federal grid dipping around an unarmored civilian was circulating in defense ministries that rarely agree on anything except caution. NATO's Rapid Assessment Cell convened a joint call with representatives from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the language in the briefing moved from municipal safety to international resilience within minutes. Batman listened in from a secure relay while Lucius forwarded sanitized datasets, aware that the act of sharing would invite parallel tests in jurisdictions with different tolerances for risk. Russia and China both issued technical inquiries through their science attachés, and when those were met with partial compliance, each deployed observation teams under the banner of infrastructure research, a polite fiction that allowed them to stage their own instruments along shipping yards and rail hubs abroad. Wonder Woman urged restraint in the Justice League channel, warning that competitive testing would multiply unknowns faster than any one apparatus could isolate, while General Lane argued that distributed trials might reveal patterns hidden at a single site. Saitama, who had been given a sandwich by a relief volunteer, asked whether the test would delay traffic because he needed to cross town, and the ordinariness of the concern stood in contrast to the gravity of a world now watching. Cause became effect when a partner nation activated a non-contact inertial field, helpfully described as a safety buffer around a decommissioned port facility, and their local monitors reported the same moving depression in density as Saitama walked along a quay to help a dockworker secure a loose crate. The data, transmitted back through diplomatic channels, matched WayneTech's earlier cancellation ripple within a margin that erased hopes of instrument error. Batman updated his contingency rails to account for the absence of stamina depletion across repeated exposures, and the catalog returned a blank where stress-induced weakness would normally appear. Named reactions arrived from Superman, who had joined the oversight channel at the request of the UN, noting that his own scans returned normal human vitals even while structural outcomes contradicted those readings. Jayons added that witness accounts across multiple sites showed minor inconsistencies in spatial recall, as if the fields nudged perception along with load, and the possibility of cognitive interaction widened the hazard profile. Lois Lane's international segment reframed the event as a global coordination problem, and the public narrative shifted from local curiosity to shared risk. The escalation moved from observation to posture when several governments announced the temporary closure of critical infrastructure for routine resilience testing, a phrase that masked the deployment of overlapping grids intended to deny motion without harm. Batman recognized the strategic doubt that accompanies multinational action, because redundancy across jurisdictions could either produce clarity or amplify the compensation that had already begun to trade normalization in one place for strain in another. Lucius warned that synchronized pulses might couple in unpredictable ways if the cancellation ripple followed Saitama's contact rather than node schedules, but the momentum of policy had its own physics. Irreversible escalation arrived with the UN's emergency authorization for a joint task force to coordinate trials and share outcomes in real time, a move that legitimized what had been a patchwork of corporate and national initiatives. The task force proposed a tightly bounded, multinational test window in which Saitama's cooperation would be requested to traverse instrumented zones under medical supervision, a plan designed to create a comparative dataset at scale. Batman understood that consenting movement through multiple grids would test the absence of behavioral pattern mapping as much as any field interaction, because Saitama's routine was driven by boredom and errands rather than strategy. Saitama agreed to walk a marked route because someone promised there would be a hot meal at the end, and the simplicity of that motivation stripped the operation of any narrative of defiance. As he moved from one zone to another, Density maps dipped and flattened in sequences that no shared protocol could predict, and a transit signal in one city dimmed, while a gantry in another reported a slight tilt. Wonder Woman called for a halt when a hospital parking deck abroad showed early compression under a deepening gradient, but the task force voted to complete the window to preserve the integrity of the dataset. As the final segment of the route concluded, a storage bay roofline in a third jurisdiction settled a fraction without dust, and rescue crews were asked to stand down until local gradients could be vented. Batman watched the shared dashboards converge on the same uncomfortable truth. Every attempt to coordinate had multiplied the trade-offs rather than reduced them. The global apparatus had committed itself to motion, and the next set of synchronized pulses was already scheduled to begin. The synchronized test window began under the watch of too many committees to count, because once the UN task force authorized shared trials, every participating nation wanted their instruments represented in the comparative dataset, and the result was a distributed lattice of non-contact fields calibrated to act without harm. Batman monitored the coordination feed from the Batcave, while Lucius translated a dozen incompatible telemetry formats into something that could be compared in real time, and Wonder Woman remained on the oversight channel to argue for safety whenever a protocol drifted toward pressure rather than observation. Saitama, given a bright vest by a coordinator who needed a visual marker for cameras, stepped onto the marked path and asked whether the vest was his to keep, and the ordinariness of the exchange made the assembled apparatus look like an answer in search of a question. The first segment engaged a shallow inertial gradient along a transit concourse abroad, and the local monitors reported a clean activation that should have introduced subtle resistance to motion. Yet the density map dipped around Saitama's outline as he paused to let an elderly commuter pass. Batman watched the depression move with him, while a luggage cart at the far end rocked slightly without registering added load, and Lucius flagged the pattern as identical to WayneTech's urban trial. Resistance, in this context, was not a shove or a wall, but a system attempting to press where there was nothing to press against, and dominance emerged as the system's inability to translate intent into interaction. Cause became effect when the second segment introduced harmonic noise meant to deny coherent motion across a loading dock, and Saitama steadied a railing to guide a worker down a step, creating a temporary normalization across 3 adjacent nodes. The normalization allowed the worker to clear, but a security kiosk 2 corridors away began to bow under a compensatory deepening of the gradient that had not been scheduled for activation. Named reactions overlapped as Superman noted that his scans still returned normal human vitals, while Jayons reported minor inconsistencies in witness recall within the kiosk's vicinity. Batman requested a brief withdrawal to see whether distance restored uniformity, and Saitama complied without hesitation, stepping beyond the instrumented zone to take a sip of water. The density maps flattened where he had been and deepened near a freight elevator on another continent that shared the synchronized window, and the task force logged the trade as a cross-site compensation rather than a local failure. Wonder Woman urged a pause to vent the gradients before proceeding, but several national leads argued that interrupting the window would compromise the comparative integrity of the trial. Irreversible escalation arrived when the third segment engaged an electromagnetic cage calibrated to probe for hidden conductors without contact, and the cage's output dipped around Saitama's hand as he helped a technician retrieve a dropped tablet. A parking structure in a partner city reported a slight settlement along a support that had passed inspection hours earlier, and rescue crews were asked to stand by until the gradient could be redistributed. Batman's contingency rails updated to reflect the absence of stamina depletion across sequential exposures, and the catalog returned nothing where fatigue curves would normally appear. Strategic doubt hardened as resistance met the same blank face across modalities, because every layer of denial produced a movable depression that traveled with ordinary gestures rather than forceful acts. Lois Lane's international feed framed the synchronized window as a moral gamble, and public sentiment began to split between gratitude for the rescues enabled by normalization and fear of the unseen costs elsewhere. Lucius warned that continuing without a predictive model risked trading safety across borders in ways no legal framework could address. The task force voted to proceed with the final segment to preserve the dataset, and Saitama asked whether the meal would still be hot if they delayed much longer, a question that carried no strategic weight but underscored the gap between subject and system. As the last field engaged, a warehouse roofline in a fourth jurisdiction settled without fracture, and teams were rerouted to prevent entry into the affected bay. Batman understood that dominance here was not a victory in combat but a proof of absence, and the system's resistance had only revealed its own limits. The synchronized pulses concluded with density maps that agreed on one thing: wherever Saitama steadied a surface or shifted his stance, the intended pressure forgot itself, and somewhere else a structure paid the difference. The next phase would have to confront the cost of that arithmetic, and the task force's agenda had already moved to containment rather than comprehension. The shift from synchronized testing to containment did not arrive as a declaration so much as a change in procurement orders, because once the task force accepted that resistance revealed nothing measurable, the only remaining lever was proximity control. WayneTech began assembling a mobile containment corridor designed to guide movement rather than block it, a sequence of overlapping gradients meant to steer a cooperative subject through zones where normalization could be applied without inviting cross-site compensation. Batman approved the corridor on the condition that it remain non-contact and reversible, and Lucius warned that steering a presence that did not interact in predictable ways could turn guidance into redistribution elsewhere. Saitama agreed to walk the corridor because the coordinators promised to keep the route short, and he asked whether the bright vest would still be required since it made him itch. The first segment engaged as he stepped inside, and the density map formed a shallow channel that should have made lateral movement feel heavier than forward motion. Yet the depression followed his casual glance toward a volunteer who dropped a clipboard. He reached to help, and 3 nodes reported temporary normalization along a wall panel that had begun to bow, allowing a maintenance crew to clear the area safely. Cause became effect when the corridor's guidance routine attempted to compensate for the dip by deepening density along an adjacent maintenance bay, a safety feature meant to keep the path stable that now created a gradient where none had been planned. A stack of storage crates settled a fraction without cracking, and Gordon ordered crews to stand by while Batman requested an immediate rollback of the lateral nodes. Named reactions overlapped as Wonder Woman urged a full vent before proceeding, while General Lane argued that maintaining the channel would produce the most useful containment data to date. The corridor advanced into its second segment with harmonic noise layered over the inertial gradient, a pairing intended to deny coherent deviation from the guided path without causing distress. Saitama paused to let a medic pass and steadied a railing that had begun to tilt, and the guidance channel flattened for 4 seconds along the intended route. A storefront awning 2 blocks away, outside the instrumented zone, began to bow as the system redistributed its intent to maintain the corridor's shape. Irreversible escalation arrived when the electromagnetic cage engaged to probe for any hidden conductors that might anchor the depression to a substrate, and the cage's output dipped around Saitama's hand as he returned the volunteer's clipboard. A hospital loading dock in a partner city reported early compression along a ramp that had not been part of the synchronized window, and the task force requested local evacuation while the gradient could be vented. Batman's contingency rails updated to reflect that emotional manipulation vectors remained absent even under institutional pressure, and the catalog returned nothing where compliance curves would normally appear. Lois Lane's live segment framed the corridor as a humanitarian compromise, using presence to open paths for rescue while accepting unseen costs elsewhere, and public sentiment fractured between relief and dread. Lucius cautioned that steering normalization through a guided route risked teaching the system to anticipate contact, a phrase that meant little to policymakers, but everything to engineers who understood feedback loops. Saitama asked whether the end of the corridor was near because he was getting hungry again, and the simplicity of the request made the apparatus hum louder. The containment push reached its third segment with an inertial deepening, intended to prevent drift toward uninstrumented space, and the channel narrowed around Saitama's path without touching him. He shifted to avoid a cable and placed his foot near a threshold, and the map showed a temporary uniformity along the next 10 meters that allowed a trapped janitor to be escorted out. A parking garage across town reported a slight settlement at the same moment, and Gordon ordered the corridor held while WayneTech attempted to vent the distant gradient. As technicians worked the vent, the corridor's safety interlock stalled, reading conflicting densities across nodes that should have agreed, and Batman ordered a halt to prevent further coupling. Lane authorized maintaining the channel until the janitor cleared the perimeter, a decision that traded one rescue for another risk, and Wonder Woman warned that the arithmetic would not favor them forever. Saitama stepped beyond the final node and asked if there was somewhere to sit, and the density maps flattened where he had been while deepening along the maintenance bay that had first reported crates settling. The final event was already in motion when the hospital ramp abroad settled another centimeter without fracture, and local crews moved to close the loading dock. The containment push had opened a path here and closed one there, and the task force's next move would determine how many such trades the world was willing to accept. The first loss does not arrive with sirens or a collapse you can point to on a map, because the hospital loading dock abroad simply settles another few centimeters without cracking, and the ramp meets the frame in a way that denies clearance to the last gurney attempting to move through. Local crews reroute through a service entrance that had not been prepared for emergency traffic, and the delay becomes the kind of variable planners pretend can be absorbed until it cannot. Batman watches the shared feed as Lucius flags the timestamp against the moment Saitama steadied a threshold back in the corridor, and the correlation appears with a clarity no one wanted. Saitama, unaware of the arithmetic, accepts a seat at the end of the guided route and asks whether anyone has seen his grocery bag, and the simple question lands in a command net that has begun to speak in trade-offs rather than safeguards. Wonder Woman calls for a full pause to vent all active gradients across participating sites, arguing that continuing without a predictive model will turn rescues into exchanges. General Lane counters that venting now could deepen densities in uninstrumented spaces, and the task force's debate becomes an operational hazard in its own right. Cause becomes effect when a storage wing in a partner city reports a uniform compression along shelving that had been cleared of personnel, and the ceiling above begins to settle with no fracture to warn of the drop. Teams on site withdraw as instructed, but a maintenance technician returning for a toolkit is caught between a door that refuses to open under emergency protocol and a corridor that has become subtly heavier than motion. Batman orders a local shutdown of the nearest guidance nodes to reduce cross-site compensation, and the command stalls behind interlocks that read densities within tolerance. Named reactions collide as Superman offers to assist with manual extraction, only to find the service door resisting in a way that does not translate into measurable force, while Jayons reports increasing inconsistencies in witness recall near the wing. Lois Lane's international feed reframes the event as a rescue delayed by an experiment, and public pressure surges toward demands for containment rather than comprehension. Lucius warns that pulling Saitama entirely from instrumented zones may remove the brief windows that have allowed any rescues at all. Irreversible escalation arrives when the storage wing's central support dims under compression, and a section of the ceiling meets shelving that can no longer move, creating a void where the technician had been seconds before. The loss is logged without dust or sound, and the command net falls quiet for the length of a heartbeat as the reality settles that a normalization here has denied access there. Batman updates his contingency rails to reflect a variable he cannot bound, presence that saves and presence that trades. Saitama stands when asked to re-enter the corridor to open a path for a trapped responder in another jurisdiction, and he complies without hesitation, stepping into the first segment as technicians re-engage the gradient. The map flattens along the responder's route, and the team moves through a doorway that had resisted minutes earlier. A transit kiosk in a third city bows under a compensatory deepening, and local crews close the concourse to prevent entry. Wonder Woman voices the dilemma that has now become policy. Every guided contact may purchase a rescue at the cost of an unknown elsewhere, and there is no model to predict the exchange rate. General Lane authorizes the movement to continue until the responder clears the perimeter, accepting the trade as necessary under emergency doctrine. Batman recognizes the shift from preparedness to moral arithmetic because the system is no longer failing randomly. It is balancing. As the responder reaches safety, the concourse abroad settles another fraction and a shopfront glass curves inward without breaking, and teams are asked to stand down. Saitama steps out of the corridor and asks whether the test is finished, and the density maps flatten where he had been while deepening along a maintenance ramp that had not been scheduled for observation. The world has begun to understand that containment may not prevent loss, and the next choice will determine how many more such trades are made. The next phase does not begin with a vote or an order, but with a failure of agreement across systems that were designed to reconcile differences automatically. Because once the task force accepts that presence creates trade-offs, every node starts to prioritize a different definition of safety. WayneTech's guidance corridor attempts to stabilize its last segment, while a partner nation vents a distant gradient, and the combined effect is a set of interlocks that refuse to disengage, because each believes the other is within tolerance. Batman watches the dashboard split into conflicting states, while Lucius reroutes power to keep the corridor from deepening along an uninstrumented maintenance bay. Saitama steps into the first segment when asked to open a path for a responder trapped behind a service door, and the density map flattens along the intended route in a way that allows the team to move. At the same moment, a transit concourse abroad reports a uniform heaviness across its floor that denies wheelchairs the motion they had minutes before, and local crews begin to reroute through a freight lift. Named reactions overlap as Wonder Woman calls for a full shutdown across all participating sites, while General Lane insists that coordinated venting could amplify compensation in places with no monitoring at all. Cause becomes effect when the electromagnetic cage along the corridor engages to probe for any anchoring interaction, and its output dips around Saitama's hand as he steadies a railing to let the responder pass. The interlocks interpret the dip as a breach in deepened density along a secondary exit that had been held in reserve, and a row of storage cabinets in another jurisdiction begins to settle without cracking. Superman offers to force the service door where the cabinets are located, but the resistance he feels does not translate into measurable load, as if the door has been asked to be heavier rather than held shut. Irreversible escalation arrives when the UN task force authorizes a synchronized vent intended to collapse all active gradients to baseline, a measure that should end cross-site coupling but risks a transient surge during release. The command propagates through WayneTech's nodes and federal grids alike, and for a moment the maps show convergence toward uniformity. Then the convergence inverts around Saitama's outline as he shifts to avoid a cable, and the corridor's safety routines spin up to maintain a guided path that no longer exists. Lois Lane reports that multiple sites are experiencing temporary closures as transit systems deny motion without visible cause, and public confidence begins to erode into fear that cannot be briefed away. Jayons adds that evacuees are struggling to recall which routes remain open, and the possibility that perception is being nudged alongside load becomes an operational hazard. Batman recognizes that the system is no longer measuring or guiding, but attempting to balance a ledger it cannot see. Lucius warns that continuing to engage Saitama as a moving normalization point will teach the interlocks to anticipate contact, and the task force's decision to proceed with the responder's extraction hardens into doctrine in real time. The responder clears the perimeter, and a warehouse roofline in a third city settles another fraction as compensation deepens along an unmonitored bay. Saitama asks whether he should stay inside the corridor or step out, and the question becomes a strategic decision with no correct answer. General Lane orders Saitama to exit to restore baseline across the corridor, and he complies without hesitation, stepping beyond the final node. The maps flatten where he had been and deepen near a hospital parking deck that had not been part of the synchronized window, and local crews are asked to close the ramp. Wonder Woman calls the pattern what it is: a system attempting to maintain integrity by trading access, and the trade has now crossed from equipment to public space. As the synchronized vent completes, a maintenance gantry at the original rail yard reports a slight tilt under redistributed load, and Gordon orders the area cleared despite it being outside any current test. Batman updates his contingency rails and finds nothing to target: no durability threshold, no stamina depletion, no stress-induced weakness, no emotional vector to manipulate, only a presence that collapses planning into exchange. The next response will not be about measurement, but about drawing lines around where trade is permitted, and the systems have already begun to redraw the map. By nightfall, the task force stops speaking about tests and begins speaking about boundaries, because the synchronized vent has restored uniformity in some places and deepened denial in others, and the pattern now crosses civilian infrastructure in ways that cannot be hidden behind technical language. Transit authorities in 3 cities close platforms where motion feels subtly heavier than intent, and a hospital abroad reroutes emergency vehicles away from a ramp that has begun to settle without fracture. Batman watches the shared dashboards as Lucius overlays public service maps, and the realization arrives that containment will no longer be about a corridor or a block, but about drawing exclusion zones where trade is permitted. Saitama sits on a folding chair near the WayneTech nodes and asks whether the hot meal is still coming, because the corridor took longer than expected, and the simplicity of the concern lands in a room now calculating exchange rates between rescues. Wonder Woman argues that using presence as a normalization point may open paths for responders while denying them elsewhere, and Superman notes that his scans still return normal human vitals despite the global outcomes. Named reactions multiply as Lois Lane reports closures in real time, and Gordon asks whether the original rail yard should be evacuated again as a precaution. Cause becomes effect when the task force authorizes one final guided entry to retrieve a trapped maintenance team in a partner city, and Saitama complies by stepping into the first segment of a reconstituted corridor. The density map flattens along the team's route, allowing them to reach a stairwell that had resisted minutes earlier, while a storage wing in another jurisdiction reports early compression along shelving that had passed inspection. Jayons warns that evacuees near the wing are struggling to recall exit paths, and the possibility of cognitive interaction forces a temporary stand down for crowd control. Irreversible escalation arrives as the central hub at the original rail yard begins to register a uniform heaviness across its service deck, a condition that denies wheeled movement without any measurable force applied. Gordon orders the area cleared, and Batman requests an immediate withdrawal of Saitama from all instrumented zones to see whether distance restores baseline. He steps out without hesitation, and the maps flatten where he had been while deepening along a hospital loading dock that had not been scheduled for observation. General Lane recommends sealing the most affected sites with permanent exclusion perimeters, arguing that trade must be contained geographically if it cannot be prevented, and the UN task force votes to draft an emergency framework for international zones. Wonder Woman counters that normalizing one place will always invite compensation elsewhere, but the policy momentum has already shifted from comprehension to management. Lois frames the vote as a global decision to live with an arithmetic that cannot be predicted. Batman updates his contingency rails one last time and finds the catalog empty where weaknesses would normally live, because there is no durability threshold to target and no behavioral pattern to manipulate. Saitama asks whether he should go home now that the team is safe, and the question becomes a moral hinge rather than a logistical one. Lucius warns that moving him through public space may open paths here and deny them there, and the choice becomes whether to keep him still or accept that stillness will not halt trade. As midnight approaches, the task force approves provisional exclusion zones around the rail yard and 2 partner sites, and municipal systems begin to reroute services accordingly. The world has moved from trying to break a contingency to building a life around its failure, and the next step will make that life permanent. The decision is finalized before dawn, because the task force understands that continuing to treat presence as a variable in an open system will only multiply the trades they cannot predict, and so the language shifts from trial to tenure. Provisional exclusion zones become permanent on municipal maps, and WayneTech's nodes are repurposed from guidance into monitoring, their job no longer to steer, but to warn when gradients deepen along public routes. Batman stands with Gordon at the perimeter of the original rail yard, as transit is rerouted for the foreseeable future, and Lucius updates service providers who now must plan around places where motion may deny itself without warning. Saitama waits near the gate with the patience of someone who has spent more time in lines than in laboratories, and he asks whether there is a bus that goes downtown because he left his groceries in a volunteer van. Wonder Woman speaks for the Oversight Council when she explains that movement through instrumented zones will be limited to emergency requests, and Superman notes that every scan still returns normal human vitals despite the global consequence. Lois Lane's morning broadcast reframes the story as a civic adjustment rather than a crisis, and the public learns to read new symbols on maps that mark where trade is likely. Cause becomes effect as the monitoring nodes log a brief normalization along the rail yard service deck when Saitama steadies a railing to let a medic pass, allowing a final equipment retrieval that had been delayed overnight. A hospital loading dock abroad reports a shallow heaviness at the same moment, and local crews close the ramp until the gradient can be vented. Batman recognizes the pattern not as failure but as rule, because the system now balances by design. Irreversible escalation arrives in the form of policy. The UN ratifies an emergency framework that permits member states to designate containment-adjacent zones where infrastructure planning must account for non-contact gradients. The framework carries no expiration, because there is no model to suggest when the arithmetic might stop, and it binds rescue protocols to a presence that cannot be profiled. Gordon orders new signage installed along the rail yard's perimeter, and city buses reroute around streets that will not reopen under ordinary conditions. Named reactions settle into acceptance as Lucius briefs WayneTech's board on a future where monitoring replaces mitigation, and Wonder Woman urges that emergency requests involving Saitama be weighed against the potential denial elsewhere. Superman offers to coordinate such requests when lives are immediately at risk, understanding that presence can open one path while closing another. Saitama asks whether he can keep the bright vest because it's warm, and the coordinator nods, unsure what else to offer. Batman updates the contingency catalog for the last time and archives a section that will never be used, because there is no biological weakness to target and no emotional vector to exploit. The system he built to break gods has instead been forced to acknowledge a man who does not participate in the assumptions that make plans possible. The dominance is not in a strike, but in a boundary drawn on a map. The world does not return to normal. Municipalities plan around exclusion zones, rescue briefs include clauses about trade, and future contingencies begin with the admission that some presences cannot be countered, only accommodated. Saitama boards a bus that has been rerouted around the rail yard and thanks the driver for waiting, and Batman watches the route change propagate through the city's grid in real time. The decisive outcome is administrative and permanent. Contingency planning has been rewritten to include an absence that cannot be modeled, and every future plan will carry the cost of acknowledging it.